Welcome to Roll for Topic, a podcast about GMs discussing issues at the table. My name is Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
And we are joined this week by Matt Wilson.
Hi, how's it going, folks?
Yeah, so we wanted to bring a guest on just to get some other opinions and also just be able to talk to some of our friends about some things that they're thinking about at the table as well. So Matt, can you just give us a quick rundown of, what games are you're currently GMing? What's sort of your brief history with running games?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I've been running games for quite some time, since I was in middle school, which was 25 years ago now. And I'm a one game at a time sort of person. Currently, I am in towards the later stages of a long running 7th Sea second edition campaign that Chris actually is a player in.
Yes.
And I am prepping as we speak for the next game I'm going to run, which is going to be a remixed version of Pelgrane Press's Eternal Lies for Trail of Cthulhu.
Oh, fantastic!
Very fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I've had it for a while. I backed it, talked to Simon about it. It's got a really great response from the community of Cthulhu GMs, and I'm looking forward to putting my own spin on it. So.
Are you running that with the Gumshoe system?
Yeah, I'm actually going to use the Gumshoe Quick Shock system, which they sort of it's not really a second edition because they're going to keep them both around, but it's a many years later refined version of the system that Robin Laws put together for the King in Yellow role-playing game, which is coming out in a couple of months.
Interesting. Do you know, what are the major changes with it? Anything?
Yeah, from my perspective, and we talked about a little bit about this beforehand, but I've been looking to streamline the mechanical engine of the system, and as Chris well knows, I, at this point in my GMing career, hate rolling dice.
Yes.
I'm just done with the whole thing of rolling dice as a GM. I mean, I'm still going to roll for, if I want to generate something random. Randomization is fine, but the whole thing where I'm, rolling a bunch of NPC things behind a screen and keeping track of all that's just too much.
Yeah.
It's altogether too much for me.
It's funny that you're running 7th Sea, a game in which your players have to roll,
I'm
more
fine
dice
with
than I've ever
players
seen.
rolling dice. You guys have, knock your socks out rolling dice, but it gets weird when I have to do multiple NPCs and roll dice for each of them and all that stuff. The Quick Shock system puts all of the dice rolling. It's a player-facing system, much like Numenera or the Cypher system, if you're familiar with that, where the player's role not only dictates whether or not they succeed, but also the consequences of how much they fail by failure. And it also has a really interesting group resolution mechanic where the challenge of an encounter, say, is set up front, and the party as a whole needs a certain level of success.
Oh, interesting.
So the stronger players in that particular type of encounter can carry the weaker ones, but everyone still gets to narrate how they're bailed out by the machine gun toting, murder hobo.
There's always one of those. Yeah.
Neurasthenic person mostly cowers behind the scenes, but yeah, so it's got a good mix of retaining the core Gumshoe investigative mechanics with streamlining the dice rolling.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to seeing how that works out.
Yeah, well, let's dive into sort of the main thing that we do here. And Andy, why don't you take over at this point? And
so the way that we do this podcast is at the beginning of the show, we or our guest roll a D10 and we check on our table of random topics to discuss, and that die roll determines what we're going to talk about for the next 25 minutes.
All right.
So Matt, if you have a D10, I'm going to need a straight up D10 roll from you, no modifiers.
All right. Well, as a 7th CGM, I have a profound amount of D10.
Yes.
I have selected my favorite crystalline purple and blue one here.
Excellent.
So I have rolled a 6.
Six.
What manner of topic is a 6?
Oh, my friends, the topic you've just chosen is how do you use DM screens?
The old DM screen topic.
Yes.
Nice.
Indeed, yes.
This is excellent. I think we all
Perfect.
have many opinions about this.
Perfect.
Yeah, so Andy, you had actually indicated you were hoping that this one was going to get rolled. So why don't you start us off?
Yes, I have a confession, and that is I have a GM screen problem. So marriage and having kids has somewhat dampened down this problem, but there was a period of time in my life where I was purchasing GM screens for every system I owned or even thought I might want to play at some point in the future. Okay. And just a week or two ago, I was cleaning out the basement, trying to clear out some of my junk, and there is like a 2-foot stack down there of GM screens going back to like the early 80s. Yeah, it was a little sobering to see all of those screens down there. I'll be totally honest with you. I have a few GM screens around the house, you might say. How about you guys?
I need to know a lot more about your screens before we move on here. Are they all used, or is it just a kind of a stack of shrink wrapped GM screens?
They're mostly used. I'm not gonna lie, there's probably a few shrink wrapped ones in the pile, if I were to look closely. But no, I've used them, although I don't necessarily use them for the system that they're like tied to.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I have a lot of like old White Wolf GM screens, and I don't really run a lot of White Wolf games. I never have. Yeah, I don't know. As we get into the conversation, we can talk more about this, but my use of GM screens is not probably their intended use. Yeah.
Intriguing.
Yes. So I'll let your imaginations go wild with that. And then, but yeah, Matt, what about you? What's your relationship to GM screens?
That's a good question. So back when I was younger, the only GM screen I had was from the Hero Quest board game. Are you familiar with the Hero Quest board game? I think who was the person that the GM was playing, like Zoltan, the Necromancer or something, with this beautiful 80s, D&D style villainous sorcerer leering out at people. And I used to use that for our GURPS games. And Andy, I'm exactly in the boat there with you. I didn't need the Hero Quest reference tables for
yes.
at that point in time. But so I used that for most of my GURPS games. I didn't use a GM screen at all, actually. When we played in college, we commandeered classrooms, and I used the lectern and the chalkboard, which was dope, and I really wish that I had one of those in my house still, although it does make you feel like an academic of some type.
Yeah.
Since then, I bought GM screens for a number of my games. So I have GM screens for like Call of Cthulhu, Trail of Cthulhu, the old 7th Sea, other stuff. But I found myself constantly frustrated with them. So I bought one of those plastic doodads, and I wish I remembered the name of the company. So
like a customizable GM screen?
Exactly. It's got pockets on both the inside and the outside, and that's actually what I use now when I use a GM screen. For the 7th Sea game, I have 7th Sea appropriate swashbuckling art on the outside and a custom inserts on the inside to remind myself of things that I find interesting. But one of the constant frustrations with them is that you don't often, like, what you need for your game isn't the same thing as what the general pool of people might need. So it's definitely an 80-20 thing, and frequently you're hoping to have at your fingertips the 20% stuff that you don't remember. What I'm looking for in a GM screen is to prevent me from having to stop the flow of things at the table and dive back into this 300-page book for an obscure rule or table or what does that dueling system let me do again? I've forgotten. So making my own with this sort of insert pocket inserts and pockets was quite helpful.
Do you end up actually writing out sort of what appears on each of those screens, or do you find a pre-made resource?
A mixture of both, actually. The internet is amazing. It's full of every kind of reference table or GM advice, from thousands and thousands of people who've done this before. So I pick and choose.
Yeah.
For Trail of Cthulhu, I mostly just had it for the art, honestly,
Yeah.
and to like hide die rolls behind or whatever. So I would actually rotate between Call of Cthulhu and Trail of Cthulhu ones because it didn't matter what was on the inside there. It was mostly just to have the evocative art. But there's a lot of things to remember with 7th. So for that, I have lists of encounters I could have, lists of names for a particular nationality where the players are, dueling styles, forever dueling styles are there.
Yes. I noted, I think last session or 2 sessions ago, you actually didn't have your DM screen with you. Yeah, so was that an intentional choice or you just didn't?
That's correct. Yeah, when we took a break in the 7th game that I'm running right now for October to play spooky gothic horror games, I went GM without a GM screen for those because, again, the system that we were playing didn't require me to hide any information from the players. All of the chancy things were in their hands. All the die rolls were in their hands. All of the decisions about what level they were going to engage with the gothic horror tropes was in their hands, not mine. So I had map printouts that I spread out on the table, but otherwise I was just there to be the narrator.
So what would you guys say is the most useful GM screen that you've ever used? And I guess you could count your kind of custom-made ones, but so tell us about the most useful one you guys have used and what made it so good.
Yeah, I would say it's just the customizations that are useful, at least for me. So I mean, the 5e game I'm running, that's pretty much the only official GM screen I think I own. Yeah, and that like most of it is just sort of useless until I added a full page of just random names on there. Yeah, so then when all my players are just asking, like who that goblin was, then I can quickly come up with a backstory with a name. Then they still proceed to, kill or torture that goblin, but at least it had a name. Yeah, because it is like, I think when it's printed by a company, it's exactly what you said, Matt. Like, right, they're trying to give you enough general information that it can sort of be quasi-usable for everybody, but then it ends up just being not very usable for everybody, I think, unless it's the first time you're reading the information.
One of the most useful GM screens I've ever owned did something that I don't really see done these days and haven't for quite a while. But eons ago, the old Top Secret SI role-playing game had this GM screen. And it was just your typical, like, late 80s flimsy cardboard screen. And I don't even know if it had art. It just had, like, terrible 80s, like, graphic design elements on it. But the thing that it did have is it had player-facing information.
Oh.
So it had, in that game, it was somewhat important that you know different like modifiers and procedures related to combat. And it had all of those frequently used combat related modifiers on the outside of the screen that the players could see. And I love that. I guess you could accomplish the same thing by giving players a cheat sheet or something in advance. But it was just nice having a reminder of the oft referenced rules on the outside of the screen for the players to see. When I read games like modern systems, like any modern system that has kind of a highly structured approach to its mechanics, like Apocalypse World Variants or Fate or something, such that you often feel the need to make a cheat sheet for your players, I think that would be like the ideal sort of thing to plaster on the front of a GM screen.
Was the text on that like readable from a distance? I guess like how much information density was on the
it wasn't a ton of information, and it's been a while since I've looked at it, but it was like a medium-sized font, so like sharp 13-year-old teenager boy eyes could read it okay. These days I probably would not find it all that usable. I mean, if you're sitting across a big table it wouldn't work, but we were all huddled around in a basement, in a creepy little circle of gaming, so it worked.
Nice. Art is great for suggesting an atmosphere, but frequently, especially in a system where there are frequently asked questions, it would be good to have that displayed in some way, because cheat sheets are definitely something that I've struggled with knowing what the right level of information density is, and it's probably it's obviously a similar problem here. That's a great idea, though, because that's one thing you could do with a customizable GM screen is put reference information not just for you, but for the players on the other side. So that's something I should consider for sure. Yeah, I included a map of the game world on the outside of the GM screen for the 7th Sea stuff. But again, it does have that problem of it's a map, so frequently the players on that side of the table will like hunch over and squint at it a little bit, and I'll be like, right, I get it, the map's not big enough.
Yeah. Yes.
Oops.
Yeah.
So why do you guys use GM screens, if you use GM screens? And it's okay to say that you don't.
I use them because, at least in the D&D games that I'm running, they're often, going through a dungeon. So it's helpful for me to have sort of my notes on one side and then the visible map for them on the other. That said, a couple weeks ago, I forgot my screen. So I had to improvise real quickly just with like a folder, and I realized that, for the most part, you could kind of get by without it. But it is a nice effect too, I think, to be sitting at sort of the head of the table, and you have this wall in front of you where you are the grand master of the game. Like, there's something nice about the theatrics of that, I think, which sort of sets the tone at the table, whether or not you hold the GM in high regard or not, whatever. If you have that sort of separation between them and the player, it can help in some ways. Yeah, but it was interesting. It's like, even a folder was enough to sort of hide the information I needed to, and it worked out fine, and everybody still had fun. So it's like, it did make me start considering, do I actually need this thing at my table?
How about you, Matt?
I agree with Chris. They're useful for sure if you have hidden information as a part of your game. The fear of the unknown, right? Like, we don't know what's in this dungeon for sure. Or if you're running any sort of mystery or investigative game where you have your notes which spell out the mystery right in front of you, it is good to have a screen to conceal that sort of information. And if you are playing in a system where you need to be making rolls yourself to determine what impacts your players are having on NPCs or the NPCs are having on them, and you want to be able to cultivate an air of mystery and adventure around that, either for hardcore, you're really going to try and let the dice fall where they may, or if you're fudging things for dramatic effect, it's important to have that screen there, regardless of which approach you personally take to NPC rolls.
Are you guys roll in the open GMs, or do you like to keep some of your rolls behind the screen?
I do it 100% for dramatic effect. I will roll in the open if it's something that they. So the most recent time I did it was, they wanted to take a rest in a sort of dangerous location, in which they shouldn't really have been, taking time to roll out their camping supplies. So for that, I ended up just rolling kind of on a random wandering monster table, on the table in front of the screen, and everybody sort of like hunched over and was watching that dice as it was bouncing around, and landing. So it was a really neat, like, dramatic effect thing. But for the most part, I just roll behind and sort of tell them, because I mean, like, when in D&D in particular, like, you can get really focused on what the number is on the die versus sort of what the narrative effect is. The more you can kind of remove people just seeing numbers adding up and equaling things on a table, I think the better.
Yeah, I'm a 100% behind the screen roller. I go to some lengths to cultivate an air of trust between me and my players, that they know that if I am cheating, it's to make the story better.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to die in a random wandering monster encounter in my game. If they do die, it will be because they've told me ahead of time they want their character to die. And it will be during a big dramatic scene in the story. Because I view my role as I'm facilitating a story that will become better if the people telling the story don't know where it's going and what they're up against at the outset. So I guess that puts me firmly in one of those new age narrativist role-playing game camps, which is fine. But I've kind of always been there, and I've always done the roles in secret, and I've always done this, even though my players for a very long time were convinced I was trying to kill them at every turn, frequently because they died. Because in stories, characters die. sacrifices are made.
I've started moving away as a lifelong roll behind the screen person. I've been trying to at least moderate that tendency a little bit and start rolling a little more out in front of the players. There's a lot of, you've brought up a number of the issues that can happen, especially in a game like D&D where you're rolling everything out in front of the players. But what I found happening was if I rolled something like if I was rolling behind the screen for monsters and they fumbled or something like that, I was finding the need to like prove to the players that I had really rolled. It was such a dramatic roll, and it was so wonderfully in the favor of the characters that I found myself needing to prove to them by showing them the die roll. So I would lift up my screen and show them. And at some point I was like, if I am getting a kick out of that like charge of seeing me roll a 1 for the ogre, I should just do that out in the open and we can all appreciate it without any suspicion that I've fudged that roll for the players.
Yeah. I'm getting so off topic, but whatever. Do you fudge rolls, Andy?
I do fudge rolls.
Okay.
I do fudge rolls. It tends to be damage related rolls.
Yeah.
And I try to keep an eye. I'm not completely like loosey goosey, like only the story matters. But that is, I do tend in that direction, and so I try to keep an eye on like character hit points and things like that. And if a goblin rolls some crazy amount of damage or stuff, I might rein that back in a little bit to keep the narrative from getting derailed by something. But I don't know. I guess I do a small amount of fudging. How about you guys?
I do a fair amount, but mostly in aggregate. Sort of what I was alluding to before we started to record. I'm weary of doing a lot of die rolls for like if I've got for dramatic purposes, say there are 14 goblins, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm just not gonna roll 14 dice. It's too many dice. So I'll roll a couple of sets of dice for they'll be broken up narratively. The fighters taking on 6 of them. The cleric is out there in the front lines of taking on more. I'll group an average rolls based on what I think the dice have told me about the general direction of that, and that's one reason why I have continued to look at systems where the GM just doesn't do any rolling. Puts that roll in the hands of the players. That way it's out in the open. And those systems tend to give players tools to mitigate catastrophic failure on their own.
If you were playing a system like that, would you use a GM screen for its theatrical effect or for the art inspirational effect?
Yeah, that's it. If there's hidden information, I would certainly want one, especially in the early going. I think to have, I would like to have some representational or inspirational art out there, whether or not it's just on the table, as I did for the Gothic horror stuff, or on the front of the GM screen. Either way is fine. And if it's any sort of mystery game, then there definitely needs to be some hidden information, some concealed area for me to like shuffle through the props or the story outline, even in a system where all the roles are player facing.
So guys, I feel a need to pause here because one thing that's interesting about GM screens, I think, is that they are like a tool that has improved like over the decades. And I think it's interesting if you look back at like the early GM screens were like literally just like cardstock, like paper. And at some point in the 80s or whenever, that paper got thicker enough that it could stand up. But I don't know if you guys remember. I mean, I would have to, a lot of those early GM screens that you'd have to prop them up with like, Mountain Dew cans or something to keep them from toppling over, because they were just flimsy. They were flimsy. And sometime in like around the turn of the century, some genius started this trend of GM screens with like this thicker cardboard, whatever the substance is. And these are wonderful. I mean, I feel like that's like a piece of technology that improved over the years.
Yeah, and it's still variable. Like it was probably 4 or 5 years ago now when I picked up Trail of Cthulhu and I got its GM screen, and it for again for somebody who started role playing in the 90s, yeah, the Trail of Cthulhu GM screen was on like 200-pound cardboard. It was very glossy and beautiful art on one side, and it stood up on its own. But then 6th edition Call of Cthulhu came out, and I got the GM kit for that, and it came with a GM screen of its own, and it was on like board game board.
Yes.
Trifold, texture, linen texture on one side, and I was like, "Holy smokes!" I thought the other one was deluxe, but no, this is really the deluxe thing. So
it's hard to go back. I mean, once you've experienced that really deluxe GM screen.
Have either of you been tempted by like a very fancy like wooden GM screen? Have you seen those, like the bespoke Etsy ones?
I have not seen a fancy wooden one, though. I'm not surprised they exist. I've been certainly sorely tempted by the extremely fancy, like wooden dice towers and dice rolling pads and all of that. The hobby has definitely gone upscale.
Yes,
let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've looked at some of those, and I'm a hack woodworker at best, but I've thought about making making a GM screen for myself, and then I kind of pause and like, do I really want that in my life? It kind of says you're a very particular kind of GM at that point. I think if you have a screen.
Sure.
Chris, you can be honest. Let's not lie, Chris. You do need that in your life.
I do, yes.
That's the sort of person you are. Okay.
Yeah. You need to get the wood carving and the little scroll saw out. So you too can have a dragon head rearing up from either end.
Yeah.
I did make myself a dice rolling box.
Oh yeah.
I got crafty. It's less useful than you'd want it to be at the table, but
yeah.
Are you familiar with a parody game called Hackmaster?
No.
Came out around the turn of the century again. It was produced by Kenzer and Company, or I think that's the name of the company. But I mention it because they had like it was a parody game based on AD&D first edition, and so they did sort of a parody GM screen that had like all of these extra fold out charts. Like it's pretty hilarious. I mean, you should Google it just to see what it is. But I mention it because they're the only company I'm aware of that ever made a player screen. So they also made a screen that like you as a player could buy to put like in front of your character sheet, I guess.
Nice.
But I don't really think there's a huge, market demand for that. But it was pretty funny.
Nice. I've heard of Hackmaster. I've never actually seen it played or not actually held it in my hands, but I've seen it at conventions and stuff. So.
Yeah, I don't know how. I've played some board games that have like little screens for each player.
Sure.
And that's kind of fun, but I wouldn't. I just looked up Hackmaster. This looks adorable.
Isn't
the cover like some parody of the classic D&D image of thieves going up a statue or something?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So how would you guys, and maybe we can wrap up in a few minutes here. Matt, you custom make your own GM screen, so this might be an easy question for you. But what's your ideal GM screen look like?
For me, what I want ready to hand is sort of that 20%, like we were talking about. Like most GM screens are tailored to get the most common information about the system in front of the GM, and that's good when you're just starting. But frequently, once you've internalized the basic rules of the system, what you need are the edge cases or the things you're never going to remember because it's a lookup table. Like if I were doing D&D and I wanted to have wandering monsters, I'd want that wandering monster table there.
Yeah.
Or case in point, in like the 7th Sea system, what I want is a concise summary of the duelist styles, so I remember what they do. Or when my players have traveled to a particular realm, I want to have names of people who might be there and reminders for what sort of things are going on there in that realm. So what I'm really looking for in a DM screen is to cover the things that I need ready to hand that I'm not going to have just internalized from experience playing the system.
That's tough because it's like as soon as you start note taking enough to write it down, sometimes then you've internalized it. At least like, yeah, it's
Sure,
like,
sure.
yeah,
But, it's got to be stuff that, you might be, 2 hours into a game.
yeah.
So you don't necessarily remember everything you've written down.
How about you, Chris?
Sometimes I think I wish I just had like 4 iPads duct taped together. Yeah.
For the low price of like $1,500,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
could
yeah.
do that, Chris.
Yeah, what were you gonna say, Matt?
I was going to say that's actually a really good, I think, adjacent question. Do any of you guys, and we can come back to it, but do any of you guys GM with a laptop?
I don't, because I would get way too distracted. Yeah. I tend to just sort of rule at the table on stuff. So if I don't know what the ruling is, I'll just make it up, and my players are comfortable with that. So yeah, to me, if I had the laptop, I would just be distracted trying to look up too many things. Yeah, so not for me.
I'm kind of in the same boat. There's been times over the years where I've had a laptop or players have had laptops, but yeah, I find if I have the option to stop the game and search for the grappling rules and waste a lot of time, I will. So sometimes it's best to just not give me that option and force me to come up with a rule on the fly, I guess. I can absolutely see scenarios where, having an iPad handy would be really useful, but so far I haven't seen that in my games. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, I tried the laptop thing for a while, but like you say, it was, and searching PDFs is a little laborious even still.
It's not good. Yeah.
It's just not optimized for that, and paging around in them is not great. So I rapidly realized they were just too much of a hassle to look things up in real time. And then, I don't know, there's something about taking notes by hand at the table that feels really nice.
Yeah, definitely.
Versus typing away or whatever. And there's also the temptation where you might have too many things. I've definitely played in a game where the game world was incredibly elaborate, a labor of love. It was all on the GM's laptop, and everything was there. And it was kind of a look problem where he knew the answer to that question because he'd answered it for himself 10 years ago and had to go find it.
I was just going to say real quick. So I ran a one shot of Kids on Bikes, which was really fun. Cool. Yeah, and at one point when we were doing character creation, we needed to pull up, I'd only had one book, but 6 people needed it. So I pulled it up on the iPad and then, sent it to someone so they could have it on their iPhone and stuff. And it was the hardest thing in the world to use just the PDF on the iPad for searching through stuff. Because it's, even in a game like Kids on Bikes, which, I think the rules are less than 100 pages, and the character creation part is like maybe 10
right.
of those pages. You're just flipping back and forth so much, and it's just like, you can't quite do that with a PDF or an iPad right now. Yeah, so there's something, like you said, like with paper, I do all my note taking just on note cards, and then I'll sometimes then I'll go write those up on a laptop later, but for the most part, it's just note cards, and then those get trashed if I don't need them, or they just sit in a stack, and then I can reference them really quickly at the table.
Right. In college, I took notes on a laptop for one of my campaigns,
Oh.
and I had like the most labor-intensive write-ups
Yeah.
I've ever done. Not that I've ever seen, but that I've ever done. It was like 2-page reports.
Yes.
After every session to my players, which is the luxury of being in college.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
Very, very detailed. On the PDF front, it's weird because I've played in a game also where the GM was blind. It was great,
nice.
Great GM.
Yeah.
But yeah, he had his iPad or laptop and was somehow vastly better at finding information in a PDF as a blind person than I was as a sighted person. So it is great that they're available in that form. I
was going to say, on thinking of interesting things that you see on GM screens, one thing I would like in my ideal GM screen is like adventure, contextually relevant information that's about like the thing that I'm running. So if I'm running D&D, I want a map of the dungeon like in front of me, not in like a folder or something that I have to flip pages to get back to the map on. And in early first edition Dungeons and Dragons modules, often the cover was detachable and you could use it as a GM screen, and it would have a map of the dungeon that module was centered around right there. So that GM screen was really only relevant to the one adventure, but you would use it with that adventure. And you don't see that so much anymore. But I have noticed that there are more like third-party GM screens out that are keyed to like specific, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons publications at least. So I know a couple weeks ago I was running the first part of the that Waterdeep Dragon Heist, and I went out and I bought there's a GM screen for just that adventure, and it's got like information on it that is only relevant really if you're running Waterdeep Dragon Heist. But it was kind of neat. It had some like art that was super specific to the adventure on the front, and on the back it had random tables and stuff that were specifically keyed to work with Dragon Heist and not some other adventure. So on the one hand, it was kind of like $15 that I can only use for this one adventure, but it was kind of neat, and it reminded me of those old GM screens that were specifically focused on an adventure.
Yeah, that's tremendous. That's a good point. We're lucky enough to live in an era where these things exist.
Yeah.
For one,
Yes.
But yeah, I do love those old modules, especially any module that's good enough to have stood the test of time has a ton of either third party supplements like GM screens available for it, or comes with one now. I'm a huge Ravenloft fan, and
Oh yeah.
I have like every version of Ravenloft they've ever published, and
That's
and
fantastic.
yeah, that first one with the cover that just comes right off, to have the map on the back. It's really
and
that's
one
really great.
I remember that one because it had like a 3D like isometric map of
Yeah,
the castle,
I think
right?
it was the first isometric map that anyone had ever
That's
seen.
something. That's
in
also
that
something you don't
context.
see every day these days.
No, no. But that is also one of the cool things about having this quad fold plastic one with the pockets, is that company, will of course host, fan created stuff. So any good or big enough module tends to have some fan who's assembled their own inserts for it, uploaded them. Definitely customized a few of those for my own current campaign.
Yeah, this conversation is making me want to go modify my screen more than I have already. So it's very fruitful. But yeah, let's go ahead and wrap it up. So
Sounds
Matt, I did not let you know this ahead of time, I don't think, but one thing we wanted to do with guests is allow you to replace the topic that we just talked about with one of your own choosing. So if you have anything that you're thinking about right now, and I'll stall for you for like a minute too, so you can think. We can do it right now. Otherwise, you can send it to us later, and we'll throw it in there with your name. And if ever comes up again, comes up in the role, we'll credit you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And there's no pressure, but if you don't come up with one, you have to sing us a song.
Yeah. Oh, geez.
Oh boy. Let me polish up the old pipes here.
Yeah, and the song has to be "Separate Ways" by Journey.
Yeah. Specific request.
That's a very specific request, and I don't know that song, so I think I'm going to come up with a topic instead. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with tabletop games is atmosphere, and what tips, tactics, strategies, dirty tricks do people have for suggesting, cultivating, and maintaining a particular sort of atmosphere?
Okay.
Because the sort of default mode, and you can edit this question down to something much more
right,
reasonable.
yes,
I'm about to
yeah.
get discursive, but the default mode at a table, right, is sort of like adventurous comedy, right? It's
Yes.
it would be a PG-13 cut down adventure movie with a lot of heavy comedic elements, and that's great. But from time to time, you want to do something like you want to step out to do like a gothic horror thing, or you're playing a Call of Cthulhu game, and it's great to have the comic relief, but you also want to like decide on what the background level of atmosphere is. Is this actually a game about cosmic terror? Is this pulp adventure? What mode are we playing in, and how do we bring all of the players along with us?
That's a fantastic topic. I run a lot of Call of Cthulhu, and within like 45 minutes, it is always Laurel and Hardy versus Cthulhu, basically on the table. I've come to accept it and even love it, but but sometimes I do wonder what would it be like? Just what would it be like?
And there's, like I said, it's great, and there's always going to be that adventure comedy slapstick element to it.
Yeah.
But I feel like I've done a decent job communicating like swashbuckling adventure.
Mm-hmm.
But as I contemplate going back into a Trail of Cthulhu game, what I want from it is something I didn't manage to get out of the Masks campaign, which was a particular tone.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's add it to the chart. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we'll add it, and you'll just have to come back on and keep rolling and see if you can get it.
Generate it myself.
Yeah. All right.
I'll crash and roll it for somebody else. Like, no.
Yes. Yeah.
I fudged the roll. You rolled a 7. Talk about 7.
Oh, we haven't even talked about the possibility of fudging the roll here.
Yeah.
You guys, the
Yeah.
format of audio kind of provides a sort of oral GM screen of a sort. So you'll have to trust us that we're not fudging this roll.
Yeah. Yeah. Always trust your GM. They have your best interest in mind.
Usually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been Roll for Topic. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. This was super great. And if we keep doing this, I hope you can come back on again sometime.
Sure thing. It's been great to talk to you. I like talking about tabletop games.
Yeah. All right. Anytime. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for listening.